a seemingly impossible task, I am going to be giving you my top 10 reads of 2023. Welcome to A Little Bit of Monica. If you're new here, I love talking about books, and today I am talking about my all-time favorite books that I've read in 2023. I read 127 books this year, and so narrowing it down to the top 10 was actually so difficult. I had quite a few 5-star reads, and all of the books on my list today are, in fact, 5-star reads, and it was just so hard to even narrow down to the top 10, but then beyond that, I also tried to rank them from like 10 to the top 1 book of my favorite book of the year, and the list gets rearranged basically on the daily. So I'm going to give you my top 10 in order. However, there are always going to be some books that get shuffled around just from how I'm feeling from day to day, but the top 10 has stayed pretty well the top 10 throughout all of my reconfiguring of everything. So I'm definitely very excited to share with you all of these top 10. I will say that because I read so many different genres, I will have a separate video coming out very soon that will cover my top 5 books in each of the genres that I read. And the genres that I'm going to be focusing on, or the breakdown that I'm using, will be the top 5 romance, top 5 fantasy and romantasy combined, the top 5 horror, and the top 5 thriller and mystery. So I will have that broken down into 4 categories and give you my top 5. So it's basically going to include all of the books that I talk about today, but it's also going to include kind of some runner-ups that didn't quite make the top 10, but are still some of my favorites from the year that I think deserve getting a shout out. So that will come later, but for today, I am super excited to be going through my top 10 favorite books of this year, and I hope that if you've read them, you loved them too, or if you haven't read them yet, I hope that you decide to pick some of them up. I absolutely loved every single one of these and would reread them, which is a big deal because I don't often reread books, so when I do choose to, you know it's a good one. Okay, so we're gonna start off with number 10, and just because it's number 10 does not mean I didn't love it, because when I read this book, I immediately knew that it was going to be in my top 10, and when I read this book, it was my reigning favorite from this author, and this book is The Carrow Haunt by Darcy Coates. I love Darcy Coates. I have loved every single book that I've read from her, and so picking up this book, I think Lexi was the one that told me that I would love this, and she was not wrong. I read this on my camping vacation. It's funny how I can even recall exactly where I was when I read this, but I was laying in a hammock reading this book and absolutely just obsessed with the atmospheric, creepy vibe. Darcy Coates does atmosphere so incredibly. This is about a ghost tour guide who hosts a ghost tour in a historically haunted house, and they are planning to actually stay overnight and kind of investigate and experience the hauntings for themselves, but things do not go according to plan. But when do they ever do? So this immediately launched to the top of my list, and it's funny that it came in at number 10 on my ranking just because I remember reading this and being absolutely obsessed with it. So honestly, most of the books on my list here I read probably since August. Like, the second half of my year was incredible for reading, but this was immediately my favorite Darcy Coates that I'd read so far, and I honestly can't remember exactly how many I had already read, but this one, so good, and I just love the way she does horror. The next book on my list might be a little bit shocking to people who have heard me gush on and on about how much I loved this book, but this is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. The sequel, Ruthless Vows, actually just came out on December 26th, so I have yet to actually get through the sequel yet, but this book was so good. I was immediately obsessed with it. I buddy read this with Michelle, as I do so many books, and I just could not get enough of this story. It is a YA fantasy romance, but it also has a lot of historical factors, which I am not a historical fiction reader. I have DNF'd a lot of books because of the historical element. So I was a little bit nervous about the historical element to this because it does have to do with a divine war. And the main characters are journalists, but they are rival journalists, and they eventually end up going in as war correspondents, so they are in the thick of the war zone for a couple of scenes, and it's just really, really intense. There are 2 scenes in particular from this book that I am not kidding you, I think about them on a weekly basis. Like, something reminds me of the scenes in this book, the way that I emotionally reacted to them. So I'm very excited to be reading the sequel very, very soon. And by the time this video comes out, I may have already read it, so oops. But I'm very excited that this book made it on to my top 10. I also lent this to a couple of different people who also read it and really enjoyed it. So I am just so glad that this book is out in the world, and I'm so glad so many people can enjoy it. The next book on my list I do not have a physical copy of because I borrowed it from the library and I have not yet received the purchased copy that is eventually coming to me. However, this book is Powerless by Lauren Roberts, and I have a full reaction vlog about me reading this book because I experienced every single emotion so many times, and I just had the best time reading this book. I don't even really fully know how to express the roller coaster of emotion that I experienced. Powerless is a fantasy romance, and it follows the main character who is essentially an ordinary. She does not have a magical ability, but she is in a world where anyone without magical abilities is killed on sight. So she has to hide and pretend that she is one of everyone else. But then she's selected to participate in the trials that are essentially to celebrate the purging of all of the ordinaries from the world and ridding the elites, the people with power, of the disease of the people who do not have power. She is thrust into this situation and encounters her polar opposite that becomes her rivals to lovers story that I am still thinking about all the time. And the story follows their journey, both of them, because we do get a dual perspective, and it's following both of their journeys through these trials and the way that they are lying to each other and trying to protect each other, and it is just so good. It is everything that I could want in a book. Is it like the perfect book? No. But it was perfect for me, and I had the best time. Like, I cannot express to you how much fun I had reading this book, and I'm kind of sad that the sequel doesn't come out for another like 6 months because I want to read it right now. But this book did absolutely make it onto my top 10, and I read this in December, so it was like a last minute addition, but I knew it had to make my top 10 because it was just the reading experience. And this book has been described by many people, including Cassidy, who is the one who kind of inspired a very large buddy read of this book. And it's described as being a combination of The Hunger Games and Red Queen. I have not read Red Queen, but I have read The Hunger Games, and I can absolutely agree that this is 100% a very close match to the themes and even some of the plot points of The Hunger Games. So if that is your vibe, then absolutely pick up this book because it was phenomenal and I love it so much. The next book on my list is the only other horror book that actually made my top 10, which is kind of shocking, but I am so obsessed with From Below by Darcy Coates that this book knocked the Caro Hunt off of my top #1 spot for this author. I already gushed on about how much I love Darcy Coates, but then I read this book and like, it was like seeing a whole new world. I cannot tell you how haunting and spooky and incredible this book was. This is about a documentary team that goes out to the wreckage site of a ship that had sunk, and nobody was ever able to figure out what exactly happened to them. The ship is fully underwater, and it is, I forget how deep they said, like 250 something, I don't know. It's so deep underwater that it takes them like multiple hours to decompress when they come back up after diving. This team is diving down to the wreckage to videotape everything and see what happened to the people who died on the ship, and they're going to discover some very, very spooky things. But I think the scariest part for me was not even necessarily the supernatural haunting element of this book, but rather it was the actual reality of technology malfunctions that they were completely susceptible to. They were putting on diving suits and literally diving down to the wreckage site, and there are oxygen tanks that could malfunction, there are things that could snag, and just like endless things that could go wrong when underwater. And I am not an underwater person. Like, I am not. I do not do deep water, and so water horror is especially terrifying to me. Part of the scariest part of this book for me was the fact that it was realistically possible that just human error and human use of technology malfunctioning could cause actual catastrophe. And I think that's part of why this book resonated so much with me, because it was more realistic that things could definitely go wrong outside of the actual spooky supernatural element that this book also brings. So again, this book, like, immediately reading it, I knew this was my new favorite Darcy Coates, and I didn't think that would be possible because I loved the Carol haunt so much. But like, this soared to the top, and it's so good. It's so good. If you love horror, spooky, supernatural vibes, but also water horror, absolutely pick up this book because it is everything you could ever want. The next book up on my list is Assistant to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. This was another buddy read with Michelle, and honestly, I was obsessed with this the whole time we were reading it. I knew it was the vibe that I was looking for from the minute it started. This is a fantasy romance, but it's more of like a cozy fantasy element, and it's very much like romantic comedy style. The main character essentially becomes the assistant to the villain. He is literally referred to as the villain in their community, and he's not a good guy, but they fall for each other anyway. And he has this soft spot for Evie, and they just click in a way that they shouldn't, but also it's adorable, and I was obsessed with the vibe the whole time. I could not get enough of this. I feel like this being a more cozy vibe makes people a little bit more hesitant to pick it up. It is not epic fantasy. It is nothing super, like, I feel like it's kind of a slow story in some ways, but there is a lot of banter. There is a lot of quirky types of interactions between them that is just it's just good. Like, I had such a wonderful time with this, and I just got to the end and didn't want to have to put it down. I do know that the sequel is Apprentice to the Villain, and it is coming out in 2024. I think the author is working on finishing it up, so I am hoping to get my hands on that sequel as early as possible because I absolutely had the best time with it. And I also was so lucky that I was able to meet the author at a local book festival signing event. So she came, and I was able to order the copy and get it signed. So this is also just really special because I love having signed copies of books because I met the author and we got a really cute picture together, and it was just such a good time. So I love this book, and I love being able to meet her and gush on and on about how much I loved the characters in this book and some of the like sarcastic, sassy, and bantery everything that was going on. Honestly, I loved this, and I think it was everything I was looking for in this type of a book. Now we make it to the top 5 books. So we are halfway through my list of top 10. And in the top 5, I'm so excited to talk about these books. But oddly enough, my top 5 and top 4 are actually by the same author, which is not surprising if you know me or anything I talk about, because I talk about how much I love this author and all of her books. But yeah, I'm just very excited. Coming in at number 5 is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is a supernatural romance, which is so different from what Ali Hazelwood typically does. I actually have all of the rest of the books right here, and I just have loved every single one of her STEMinist novels. Women in STEM, women in science, and just taking on the world in an academic setting. I really, really love the way she writes. This book though, Bride, is such a different vibe. It is completely opposite to anything I would have expected, and I loved it. Like, I was so nervous, but I loved it wholeheartedly. This is a romance between a vampire and a werewolf, but it is an arranged marriage, and he is the alpha wolf of his pack. And there is a lot of drama that goes on behind the scenes. There is a missing person involved. There is a lot of drama, but it's like good drama, because there's a lot of romance drama that I hate, like love triangles and unnecessary third act breakups. And I feel like this book just gave me what I wanted and left me happy in the end. And I am just obsessed with that. It is a totally different vibe than what I would have expected to like, because it does have a bit of spice to it, as most of her books do, but this was a different level of spice because of the nature of the characters. However, I still loved it. I don't even care. It was so good, and this book isn't even out yet. I think it comes out in February, if I'm remembering correctly. But I had an e-arc, so I was able to read it in advance. I cannot wait for this book to come out because I will be buying the regular edition and probably a special edition as well, because I loved this so much, and I could not even explain to you why or how this worked, but it just did. And I did not stop thinking about it for weeks after finishing. This was also another buddy read with Michelle, and we were both having the best time and completely shocked but obsessed with this book. And now, following Bride, I mentioned that I had 2 books by Ali Hazelwood back to back. So the number 4 book on my list is Check and Mate, also by Ali Hazelwood. And I have 2 copies of this book, again, because when I'm obsessed with something, I get it in multiple forms. So this book I actually received the day of the release, which was November 7th, which is the same day as another really popular book that came out that may or may not be kind of on this list. But Check and Mate came out on November 7th, and I pre-ordered this one from a indie down in Texas, I believe, and it came signed as well with a little chess doodle in there, so I absolutely love this. And then this copy was the Afterlight special edition copy, which I got the special edition of Love Theoretically as well. Look at the sprayed edges. Look at them. This is gorgeous. Also, this is a reversible dust jacket, so I decided to use the cute special design, but it does have like a reversible dust jacket. So I love this so much. Anyway, let me talk about what this book is actually about, because this is Ali Hazelwood's YA romance about a chess whiz who has kind of retired from the chess game, but then she meets another chess whiz and she is suddenly brought back into the world, and she remembers how much she loved it, and they end up competing against each other a couple of times, and a romance forms. And it's so beautiful, but it's also like they're young characters, so there's a lot of afraid to face their feelings, and I don't know, like it does feel very YA sometimes, but at the same time I did not care because I loved everything about this book. The characters were just so lovable, and I have a weird obsession with things about chess. I just really am fascinated by the game itself and the ability to learn and perfect it, and just professional chess players confound me so much, but I am so fascinated by it. And so reading about it, absolutely the best time ever. I was obsessed with the show The Queen's Gambit, and this was giving me all of the Queen's Gambit vibes plus more romance, because The Queen's Gambit didn't give me nearly enough romance, but this one had it all. And so I cannot stop gushing about how much I loved this book, and I want to reread it. Like, I finished it and wanted to start back over again. I loved it that much. So definitely, if you are into romance, it is YA, but it's Ali Hazelwood, so it's like, you know, it's good. It's good romance, and I need everyone to read this because it's so good. I made my sister read it, and she had never read Ali Hazelwood because she does not read spicy romance, and she still enjoyed it. So this is fantastic, and it is less spicy because it's YA. So definitely recommend this for anyone who wants to try out romance or loves chess, because there's so much of it in here. I need to stop because I could go on forever about this book. The third book on my list of favorites for the year is one actually came in very, very close at the end of the year, but I read it and immediately could not stop thinking about it, and this book also has not been released yet. So this is Till There Was You by Lindsay Hammeroff. This is a romance, and oh my god, I just had the best time. And I know I've said that a lot about all of these books, but I cannot tell you how many times I was literally giggling to myself. I literally, not exaggerating at all, was laying on my stomach, kicking my feet, and like giggling and crying over how cute this book was. The story is about a chef and an up-and-coming musician. They meet and they have a one weekend stand, and then he goes away to record his music. And what does he do? He records some music that is all about her and how much he loved spending time with her, but then he ghosts her and she's confused. And then when he reappears like a year later, they are faced with their pre-existing feelings, and the feelings that still do exist, and so they have to navigate this relationship. What do they want out of the relationship? How do they navigate everything? How do they work through the previous hurt? And there was just everything was so good. I feel like they had some of the most healthy communication in a romance that I've read in a long time. There were multiple times where one of them would be upset and the other one would straight up be like, I can tell something's bothering you, please tell me what's going on. And that just doesn't happen that often because romance books are supposed to be dramatic, and so nobody ever communicates healthily. And I feel like this book had so much good communication. I was just amazed and I loved it. But on top of all that, the characters were all lovable. Like, I loved both of them so much. And that doesn't happen often either, because usually there's one character that's really irritating. Like, you love one, but you tolerate the other one. No, in this one I loved them both. I thought they were both incredible, and they were both trying their hardest to be their best and give their best, and it was everything. And on top of that, Lindsay Hammeroff wrote in so many pop culture references that were so targeted to me. I thought that I wrote this book in my sleep. I've said that before, but I'm not exaggerating. I finished this book thinking if I had written a book and I included pop culture references, it would be this book. Like, this is what would have happened, because everything felt like exactly the things that I love. And I just, oh my gosh, I can't believe this book isn't even out yet and I'm spewing nonsense about it. I loved it that much. It immediately skyrocketed onto my top 10, and I've slowly been like notching it up on the list too, because it did start a little bit lower, and the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, no, this book was everything. This book was Monica coded, and so it needs to be higher up on the list. So it made it to the top three, and I didn't even read it until like the second week of December. So if that tells you anything, I loved this book so very much. But now we come to the top 2 books for 2023. And honestly, this next one is not going to be surprising to anyone who knows the type of books I read, because book number 2 is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. And subsequently, I want to lump Iron Flame in here because I really loved Iron Flame almost as much as I loved Fourth Wing. I didn't want to put both in my top 10, but I really did have a great time with both of them. So clearly I have 2 copies. I have the special holiday edition and I have the first edition that I got basically right before the first editions were sold out. So I am really lucky to even have this copy. But Fourth Wing, a romantasy about a dragon school. The main character faces a lot of challenges with her body in the way that she is training, and people look down on her and think that she's not capable, but she clearly is. And then we meet Xaden. Enough said. We meet Xaden, and Violet and Xaden, let me just tell you, I love them so much. Like, the 2 of them, I know there's a lot of jokes going on about people who are like, oh, I wanted Xaden Ryerson for Christmas. Like, no, I want Xaden and Violet together. I don't want him for myself. I want him for Violet because I love them together so very much. I am obsessed with this book, and I have read it twice. I reread this book twice in 1 year because I read this book in May, and then the sequel came out in November, and before the sequel came out, I absolutely read the first one again because I had that good of a time that I read it twice within a 6-month span and had no issues whatsoever. I enjoyed this just as much the second time, and because I knew what was coming, I was emotionally prepared and did not have a breakdown as much as the first time. During the second book, I also did have quite an extensive breakdown, which you can also view in my spoiler reaction vlog that you get to see every emotion that I went through when reading Iron Flame, because if I am anything, I am honest with the way that I will visibly react to things. I make faces, and I cry, and I laugh, but I mostly cried out of anticipation. Part of the problem with books that are intense like this is that I cry simply because I'm afraid of what I think is coming next. I will cry in anticipation of tense situations or tragedy. So anytime I think something bad is going to happen, I might start crying because I'm afraid of what's going to happen. But enough about that. This book, if you haven't heard about it yet, you should read it because it's amazing. And even people who don't love fantasy or who didn't love fantasy before they read this and they ended up liking it so much that they read other fantasy books afterward. So if you want to give fantasy a shot, I absolutely recommend doing this because it's got dragons, it's got romance, but like tasteful romance, and then it's got just everything. It's got found family. It's don't even know what I'm saying anymore. I just can't stop talking about this book because of how much I loved it. But seriously, if you probably already heard enough about this book, but it's my number 2 for a reason, because I loved it so much. So anyway, my number 2 book of the year, which brings me now to the number 1 book that I read this year. And once again, because if I love a book enough, I will find a special edition of it. And I did that again with this one. Now, I want to say that this book was actually so surprising, and I think one of the reasons why it made it into my top 10 in the first place is because of how surprised I was that I loved it as much as I did. I had never read from this author before, so this was my first exposure to her writing, and I was thoroughly impressed. And it does make me want to pick up some of her other books, although I do know that some people who really liked this one may not have loved some of her other ones, but I had the best time with this, and I know I am talking so vaguely about it because I haven't actually shown you the book yet. However, the book that I am talking about is The Unmaking of June Pharaoh by Adrienne Young. Now, I buddy read this with Michelle, as I do with so many books. We read this together because she was doing an event with the author, so we were specifically trying to read it in a way that would help us come up with talking points and things that we wanted to point out about it. So I was reading this book from a more critical standpoint to come up with talking points about it, and I still had one of the most wonderful reading experiences of my life. It felt wholesome, it felt beautiful, it was intense, but also it had a slow pace, so it didn't feel like things were happening. It was a softer approach to a fantasy type element. So this is a fantasy novel, but it also has a historical element, which I mentioned before. I don't do well with historical fiction, and I have DNF'd plenty of historical fiction type books. However, it worked so well in this book. It's almost enough to get me to read other historical fictions. It's not enough because I know that it wouldn't work for me, but this book was so freaking good that I bought the Owl Crate Special Edition. I don't have Owl Crate, so I had to buy this on Pango, but this book is beautiful. Let me just put the other one down so I can show you how freaking gorgeous it is. It has red pages because the red door is a theme in the book. It has gorgeous end pages, a reversible dust jacket, and is also signed with a note from the author. So yeah, you could say that I'm obsessed with this book, and I have not stopped thinking about this since I read it back in, I can't remember if this was August, maybe September. I can't quite remember exactly when we ended up reading this, but this story follows June Pharaoh, and she encounters a red door in a field. The first time, she thinks nothing of it, but eventually she decides to go through that door, and what she finds beyond that door is absolutely life-changing for her. She comes from a family of women who have some sort of condition that leads them to, according to the public, go crazy. They lose their minds, and she's really terrified that this is going to happen to her. So she ends up going through this red door to discover what is behind it and maybe seeking some answers for what plagues all the women in her family. I just absolutely loved all of Adrienne Young's writing in this book. I'm gonna put down the special edition because it's pretty, but this is the normal, cover. So just going on a little bit more about this book, Adrienne Young's writing is absolutely beautiful in this book. And again, this is my first exposure to Adrienne Young, but I was so impressed with the lyricism. It just felt like her descriptions were so poetic and they were so vivid that I am a moderately visual reader, as I've mentioned previously, that I visualize scenes when they are happening. However, I don't typically envision specific details, descriptions of people or surroundings, like colors of things. I don't necessarily visualize that kind of stuff, But with this book, I was visualizing so much, and I was just able to picture exactly what was happening, despite it having the fantasy elements that it does. And it was doing so much for me. I didn't want to put this book down, despite its slower pace, because it is more of a drama than anything, but like, it was so good that I didn't want to put it down. And when I finished it, I could have picked it back up and started right back over again. It was so good. There were a couple of twists that were thrown in that absolutely rocked me. There was one, I don't want to say it's necessarily a twist, but there was a big reveal that happens near the end of the book, and it got me so hard that I cried. I cried out of shock and like understanding of what had just been revealed. And to me, like, evoking those types of emotions is what can really catapult a book into my favorites, because I'm going to remember it more. And that's exactly what this book did. It was unexpected. I did not think I was going to have such an emotional reaction to this book. I would never have thought I would cry at it, but I did. I cried multiple times, and I felt so at peace reading this. And that's a really weird thing to say, and I don't know if it really makes sense, but just reading this made me feel really good and like warm inside. And that's like the core of it. I think this book just made me feel really good. There were things that she encountered that were dramatic, and she had to make really difficult choices that impacted her life and also everyone around her. And I felt like I was there with her, like watching this unfold before my eyes. And that's just such a beautiful thing to experience with a book. And again, I think that's why I ended up loving this book so much. I know a lot of people who have read this and did not like it at all. I know people who read it and DNF'd it. And that's perfectly fine. For some reason, this book was everything to me. And I bought a second edition of it because of how much I loved this book and the effect that it had on me. So I can't necessarily like fully explain it, but I ended up really, really loving this book. And I can't believe I almost forgot to say this, but this book is also signed by the author. A packet of flower seeds. In this book, June Pharaoh, her family owns like a flower farm, and so I got a packet of flower seeds, which is so freaking cute. But anyway, Michelle hosted an event with this author, and she got a copy of it signed and sent to me because she's amazing, and I love Michelle so very much. So I love this book. It means so much to me just because of the memories I have with reading it, surrounding reading it. I really want to plant these flower seeds. I'm like really distracted by this. I forgot that they were in here. I like closed them back in the book, and I forgot that they were in here because it's been a couple of months since I read it, but now I'm reminded and I love it so much. Anyway, I love this book. That's how I'm gonna sum it up. So if you like more of like a historical cozy fantasy type of vibe, I definitely recommend trying this out. It's definitely not for everyone, but that's okay. And I do think that there is the potential for other people to really, really love it, because I did. I loved it with my whole heart. And I really hope that other people can end up loving it as well, even if you may not have loved other Adrienne Youngs, because I think Michelle had read a couple other Adrienne Youngs and ended up loving this one way more than the other ones she had read. So I definitely recommend giving this a shot, because this is my favorite book of 2023. There, I said it. It's my favorite book of 2023. It feels so good to say that out loud, because I've been playing around with trying to figure out exactly which book would take the top, and to know that this one, like, I feel good about this choice. I feel very strong. Like, this has been a solid #1 spot since I read it. And even when I would finish a book and the fresh love of like Check and Mate or Bride or Iron Flame, things like that I read after this book, even in that moment, I still kept this one at the top. And so it just feels good to have this one and know that this was so good. And now I have 2. So anyway, number one. But now that I've revealed all of my top 10, that brings me to the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed going through this journey with me. I know I talked about them a little bit more than I expected to, but that's because I loved these books so very much. And they made it into my top 10 for a reason. And that's because my personal reading experience with them was so positive, was so fun, and they either made me feel good or they made me feel so many emotions that it was just such a beautiful experience of reading it. And I hope that maybe me talking about these, if you haven't read them, hopefully you decide to pick them up. And if that's the case, please let me know in the comments that you plan to try to read these in 2024, because I really want more people to read them. Some of them are wildly popular already, and that's fine, but some of them are not so widely talked about. So I really, really encourage you to try them out if they sound like they'd be something up your alley. And of course, to let me know that you decide to do that. But also, if you've already read any of these, please let me know what you thought about them, and let me know if they made it into your top rankings for the year, because it was so hard to narrow it down, but this is where I have landed. And a reminder that I will have an upcoming video where I do my top 5 in each genre. So all 10 of these are going to be in that video as well, so I won't really talk about them too much. But I will go into a little bit more of the runner-ups to my top 10, the ones that I wish I could have talked about in my top 10, but there's just not enough space for, 30 books in a top 10, because that just doesn't work. So I'm really excited to have that video coming out really soon, and I hope that you will take some time to watch that. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button so that you can follow along with my journey, and I have so many fun videos coming up in 2024 that I'm really excited about, and I'm hopefully gonna find some new favorites very soon. And if you want to hit the little notification bell as well, you'll be notified when I post the next video of my top 5 in each genre. I want to thank you so much for watching this video and anything that has come previously, and I want to thank you for any future videos that you might be watching. I'm so excited to have you here with me, and I really hope that I will see you in the next one. Bye!